When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise in banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi making Kiwi better off. I've been talking to my mother recently, who's in a nursing home, about her life as a child, growing up next to a railway line in Northland. Her mum and dad, my grandparents, ran the cafe at the railway station north of Auckland. And this was during the war years when there were huge numbers of people going back and forth from military camps in Northland to Auckland, often American soldiers. And the numbers of people using that rail line were stunning to me. This is very remote Northland, where you'd be lucky to see cars on roads these days. How is it that decades ago we had a high-functioning, heavily used railway network for passengers? So not just containers or logs, but passengers. And how come we don't have that anymore, even though our population is 5 times larger than it was back then? This week on When the Facts Change, I talked to public transport advocate, but also, frankly, one of our best indie singer-songwriters, Anthonie Tonnon from Whanganui, where apart from his main gig, being the writer of award-winning songs and the most amazing music, I highly recommend Anthonie Tonnon. And his gigs are fantastic. He's also the Whanganui representative on the Horizons District Council's public transport operations. And you'll listen to this episode and wonder, A, how he gets his time for his real job, because he's right on top of the network economics of public transport in New Zealand's towns and cities, creating elasticity of demand, i.e., when you increase the scale of your network for public transport, you put $1 in and you get more than $1 back in demand if you can create a real network. And that's what's needed in our small towns and cities. Anthonie tells us how there is plenty of low-hanging fruit in these smaller towns and cities with well over 1 million residents who currently aren't using public transport enough. And there are plenty of examples. Queenstown, for example, which created a network and transformed its use of public transport and solved some of its congestion problems. There is an opportunity here which Anthonie gives us a sneak preview here of how we could change the way we think about transport spending and do it in a way that keeps everyone happy right across the political spectrum. Remember, we're looking at spending billions of dollars on motorways, tens of billions of dollars on rail tunnels and rail networks. Why shouldn't we spend much, much, much less than that, much, much, much sooner on electric bus networks, not just inside towns and cities, but between towns and cities to create that network effect? That's this week with Anthonie Tonnon, back again on When the Facts Change, to talk about public transport and how we can do it better. Well, kia ora to Anthonie Tonnon and welcome back to When the Facts Change. It's wonderful to see you there in Whanganui.
Kia ora, Bernard. Nice to be here.
This is a real treat for us because this is a repeat performance on When the Facts Change, one of our favourite episodes ever, back in July of 2021, as I went on a field trip, which is unusual for me, to Hokinui, where you did a wonderful job of showing us not just the history, but maybe the future of public transport in that city. And it's a real pleasure to have you back on to see where things are going now, because stuff is changing. It does seem like a long time ago now, back in the good times before we had the bad times with COVID. Could you give us a sense of why we're talking about public transport? Because other people may know you from your amazing back catalogue of music and performances, but how come you've become a bit of a public transport advocate, geek, nerd, person who's really doing a lot of work on it?
Well, musicians travel a lot, and I travelled a lot starting out as a musician to tour, and eventually I got sick of driving around everywhere, and I started shrinking my setup. And when I'd go to Australia, for example, making sure that I could catch a bus and a train instead of a taxi to the gig, and then at the same time, I once made a music video in Dunedin, and just as a random topic, we made it about the old railway stations I'd seen growing up in Dunedin. But that actually got me doing some research and realising that we actually used to have really great public transport networks in the small places as well as the large ones in Aotearoa. And so I made a show about it called Railland, and I thought that would satisfy the itch, but it didn't quite. And so I ended up becoming a public transport advocate as a sort of part-time pursuit, as well as being a musician.
And I'd recommend all of our listeners to go back to that July episode, which we'll include a link for in the show notes. It's the first, and so far the last time we've done an episode in a tunnel, and it's been great. It was great. That's enough of a teaser. We won't spoil it. You'll enjoy it going back to listen to it. Anthony, you mentioned that, particularly in smaller towns and cities throughout Aotearoa, we used to have an awful lot of public transport, not just within these towns and cities, but also between them. That was a long time ago, and now a lot of people get around in cars. And so far, the debate about public transport has very much been about the big cities. How do we get light rail in Auckland, or let's get Wellington moving, or even a rail line in Christchurch. But tell us about, how there might actually be more low-hanging fruit in some of the smaller cities and towns provincially than you might think.
Yeah, well, we spend much less in the smaller cities on public transport than we do in the larger cities, not just as a raw figure, but actually as a per-person number. The other thing is I was in Auckland in the 2010s when it improved its public transport patronage phenomenally. And it largely did it with quite cheap interventions, like really patronage-focused bus routes. So basically more buses, more drivers, more frequency. And that got their trips up to 60 public transport trips per person per year. In places like Hawke's Bay or Wanganui, Palmerston North, we're generally sitting at about 5 to 10 public transport trips per person per year. Because we don't have patronage-focused bus routes, we actually have coverage bus routes, which cover a large area, but with very few services. And we know that they won't actually get many people using them, but we have them there as a sort of means of last resort. Queenstown flipped this model around in 2017 and introduced a patronage-focused bus system for a city of only about 40,000 people. And that's seen their public transport trips per capita go up to 30. So that has interesting thoughts for regional New Zealand, because we actually have 1.4 million people that live in large cities, large urban centres, bigger than 30,000 people and up to the size of Hamilton. And if we could get them from 5 to 10 trips per person per year to 30, that's actually a lot of public transport trips we could get without building any expensive rail infrastructure, simply by getting buses and drivers. And the turnaround is quite quick compared to, Auckland does need to keep growing its trips, and it has ambitions to double and further its public transport patronage, but it is going to require big infrastructure investments. Whereas we could take a leaf out of Auckland's book from 10 years ago and without big infrastructure investments, use our roads and get more patronage-focused bus services in the regions. And that's within the centres. And in Wanganui, we've improved our public transport patronage by 80% in the last 3 months.
Can you tell us about how you did that? And, because on the face of it, in these smaller provincial cities, a lot of people say, well, I can get myself a cheap Japanese used import, and even with higher fuel prices, it's not so expensive. It's very flexible. Why do I need a bus?
Yeah. Well, so the way we did it in Wanganui, we have for the last 30 years, we've had a coverage bus system. Now, back in the day, Wanganui was built around a tram system, and it had 3 million trips per year or 70 trips per person per year, which is what Wellington does today per capita. Before our new service, let's say last year, our system did 3 trips per person per year in Wanganui. But that's because it uses a coverage bus network. It goes every 2 hours. It covers lots of ground, but it's not useful for many people because it only goes every 2 hours. So we tried an experiment. We took our main old tram corridor through the spine of the city, sort of following the river, and we introduced a bus that goes every 20 minutes, 6 days a week, 7 to 7 on weekdays. And so it was a page out of the patronage playbook rather than the coverage playbook. So that one bus route is now doing 49% of our patronage, and our total patronage as a city in the 3 months we have data for, March to May, has risen by 80%. And even more so on that one corridor where we chose to put a bus. Last year, we had 3 coverage routes on that corridor, and they did about 10,000 trips in a 3-month period. This year, on that same corridor, the 3 bus routes we had last year and the new Tide route did over 23,000 trips. So it's a 134% increase on one corridor. So yes, it's true. It's really easy to drive a car around a city like Wanganui. But when I lived in Auckland, it was easy to drive a car around Auckland as well most of the time. But what I learned to love in Auckland was the choice, was the idea that I could have a car at home, but some days I could just not take it, or I could keep it at home so that it was available for my wife and I could go away on a bus. So the way I pitch it to people who aren't sure if a bus is for them is that I'm actually just giving them more things. They might already have a couple e-bikes and a couple cars, maybe a double cab ute. I can't stop them from having those things, and I don't want to. But if I give them another option, which is taking the bus, they might actually find they enjoy leaving the big car at home some days.
Let's say an enlightened government decided, okay, let's increase the public spending per person in some of the regional towns and cities from $10 to something closer to the $300, like in Auckland, Wellington and the likes. What would you do if you had an opportunity to really go for it?
Well, we'd introduce networks. So we've introduced one spine patronage-focused route. It's patronage-focused mostly because of its frequency. That's what starts to make it useful for adults. And I should say that we've had a huge rise. Our biggest rise in users has been from full fare-paying adults, who are now our largest user group, overtaking Super Gold Card holders, even though both have increased. But it's just one route. And there's interesting economics to this. So when you introduce more frequency, by itself on one route, that only has an elasticity of demand, usually less than 1. So if you double frequency, you get a little bit less than double passengers. However, if you create a network with 4 different routes or multiple different routes, then that elasticity of demand rises. So say if you bring in 4 times the routes and they connect to each other, you can actually get to an elasticity of demand of 2, 3, or 4. And that means for every extra service you put on, you're actually getting twice as many passengers. So how would I spend that money? I'd create networks. And that's why Queenstown's network has been so successful. It went from 600,000 users before 2017 to 1.5 million a year and a half later.
And once you've created those networks inside these smaller provincial towns and cities, then there's an opportunity to create a bigger network between them. Where are we now with the idea of more frequent intercity buses and maybe even more trains in future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just looking at vehicle counts. So the Horizons region is really interesting for this because we're quite multipolar. We don't have one massive dominant city. We have Palmerston North, which is about 1.5 times the size of Whanganui. And then we have many large and medium and small urban areas, often scattered around the old train routes or NZ Rail bus routes. And if you look at the vehicle numbers on some of those stretches, you get over 10,000 up to sort of 16,000 between Levin and Otaki, for example. And a huge part of our public transport patronage in the mid-20th century was inter-urban and inter-regional travel. A huge problem at the moment that we've had since 1989 is that public transport has been reorganised around water catchment boundaries. And so it's been, while we've actually improved urban public transport in some cities, we've kind of lost sight of the idea of creating public transport that crosses from one city to another, and especially from one city or town to another if it crosses a regional boundary. So for example, it's almost East Berlin, West Berlin, 1989 kind of situation in our region, because from Otaki to Waikanai, there are 19 bus services per day to get people from Otaki to Waikanai railway station. And Otaki is the border of the Greater Wellington region. Now, 20 minutes further up the road in Levin, we as a Horizons region collaborate with Greater Wellington to run a bus from Levin to Waikanai railway station. We run it 2 times return a week. Oh. So that shows you, and the vehicle movements from Otaki to Waikanai are around 21,000 per day. Vehicle movements from Levin to Waikanai are 16,000 per day. So they're pretty similar, very high numbers, and there could be very high potential to get more people travelling from Levin to Waikanai each day by public transport. And there's many places where this is the case, and I think so. Horizons right now are consulting, and we've got a public consultation out that's looking at, do we want public transport between towns? And one thing that's really great is that we haven't ruled out people saying to us, yes, we do, and we want public transport that crosses a regional border as well. Because a really important factor, because our population in Horizons is sometimes a bit limited, or is certainly seen as a limiting factor for public transport. But the larger the populations you can connect on a bus route, the more viable they'll be. So, while it might be hard for us if we're only thinking about, okay, we want to get frequent buses from Levin to Waikanai, if we think a bit further and we go, no, well, we're going to go from Waikanai railway station, which gets us actually to Wellington, and we want to keep that route going to Palmerston North, or we want to have a branch that goes to Whanganui, or even a branch that goes to New Plymouth. Then if you start talking about connecting New Plymouth and Wellington, or Palmerston North and Wellington, then you actually have large population catchments, and you can justify a lot of demand.
So in a way, you're creating a new network effect and getting some elasticity of demand that's bigger than just a city. But at the moment, it sounds like the regional councils set up checkpoints. No, they don't, obviously, but the bureaucracies and the funding systems aren't really designed for them to work together or to share bus companies or have the same ticketing systems, which is sort of frustrating. How do you think that could change? How is the work going to make it change?
Well, it was maybe a slightly missed opportunity in the recent review of the Public Transport Operating Manual. The initial recommendation was not to change the settings to do with interregional public transport. And the difference here is that in an urban area, a regional council can take over the public transport and basically say to all operators, if you want to operate a bus service, you can only do things, you either need our permission or we can tender you to do it, but we need to create the network so that it's efficient. At the moment, we can't really do that across regional borders. However, there's a growing awareness of this problem, and it was very interesting at the Interregional Rail Conference a month or two ago that an expert on rail travel, Darren Davis, pointed out that we could change one sentence in the public transport operating model and its successor around interregional boundaries. And if we just simply removed one sentence, we could give public transport across borders the same treatment as we do urban networks. But even if we don't get there, the regional councils are thinking about this. So Horizons and Greater Wellington are talking to each other. When we had consultation on our regional public transport plan, Taranaki submitted, Greater Wellington submitted. They're all thinking about these things. And Waikato Regional Council is already drawing lines on its maps and its plans, having them cross the boundary with Horizons and reach Taumaranui, for example.
Because I can imagine now some of these regional councils and local councils have to think about their emissions footprint. There's things that are being built into regional plans, long-term plans, and of course there's the overall commitment that the government's made to reach our Paris Agreement targets, which to get anywhere near, we're going to have to shift a lot of people out of cars, really. There's only so much you can do with shifting to electric cars and moving into public transport in all sorts of ways. Do you sense that the councils are beginning to realise that this is an opportunity as much as it is a nice to have?
Yes, absolutely. But I would say probably my impression for most regional councils is that it's not even so much about the VKTs, that yes, we're rewriting our plans now to reduce vehicle kilometres travelled. But actually there's growing pressure from the public to actually provide us with ways of getting around our region, getting to the places we need to go, which aren't just within the one town or city we've chosen to live in, without needing the car. And that's particularly pressing in a place like the Horizons region, because no one city has so much that you can do all your business and entertainment and family stuff in one place. You do find yourself on that highway going through Bulls or Sanson or Levin quite often. And it's quite dangerous. We know that stretch of road between Levin and Otaki is particularly can be quite fatal. And it's also just a lot of lost time for me to have to do a 1 hour meeting in Palmerston North, which I do a lot. I spend 2 hours in a car. And I can't do anything else but keep myself safe. And actually, when we look at the alternative, when you look at people who live in the Greater Wellington region, if you live in Masterton, you have 5 trains a day that can take you to Wellington. If you live in Waikanae, you have a train that can take you every 20 minutes. Now there has been a lot of talk about rail, of course, and that's always the gateway drug for a public transport advocate, and it was for me, an interest in rail, and there's a lot of community movement for bringing back rail to places like Whanganui at the moment. And many of us would like to get there. But I guess what I've learnt from being an advocate in this area is that the time horizons, you're looking at decades or a decade and a half if you're really lucky. Whereas, Horizons are consulting on this review for a potential network of bus routes that don't just connect us from city to city, they also connect us to the existing rail network, like Wellington's very good rail network. But if people answer that consultation and want those services, we could get them in a matter of a few years.
And that's the difference, isn't it? That, a lot of the debate around public transport has been about, light rail, it's a $45 billion project and it'll be finished in 2063 or something. And of course, if you're against that sort of big government project and you worry about words like $65 billion, you can very easily attack something like that. But if, for example, there's been $1 billion spent on one section of a motorway between Waikanae and Otaki. Just imagine what you could do with $1 billion in terms of buying electric buses, employing people on a network. In fact, much less than $1 billion. I wonder if there's an opportunity here in the political debate, I'm thinking of the political economy here, to flip everything on its head and say you can achieve a lot more with a very quick and relatively cheap bus network than you can with either a big heavy rail project or an even heavier motorway project.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm trying to think non-partisan as well, and what we can get done, regardless of what colour the government is. And a lot of the councillors that I represent on the Whanganui District Council, have different political views. But, one thing that both kinds of governments in the last 30 years have done is build us very nice roads. And actually that's an advantage for public transport using buses. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some things we can do in rail. I mean, for example, the New Zealand Upgrade Scheme just gave us a $26 million refurbishment of our Capital Connection carriages. But we only run them once a day when there is time to send them back to Palmerston North each day and do a second run. There are some easy wins there with the rail network, but they can work together. So, for example, our regional council, along with district councils along the main trunk line, spent the last couple of years investigating a feasibility study with KiwiRail for a main trunk service from Wellington to Auckland, particularly looking at the Palmerston North to Hamilton section, perhaps connecting to Huia and Hamilton and the Capital Connection in Palmerston North. Unfortunately, while we did get our new trains for Palmerston North to Wellington, the main trunk line project was shelved. So it sits on the shelf now for I'm not sure how long. However, we could start a bus service that ran from Palmerston North every day. If it left at 8 from Palmerston North, it could arrive in Hamilton before 1:30, which would mean that you could switch to Te Huia and you could have a full journey from Palmerston North to Auckland. So that way you're connecting 1.5 million people in Auckland at one end, and you're connecting 100, 200,000 people along that corridor, not to mention the 200,000 people that are in Hamilton as well. So again, but the other thing is, we often go too micro on this. One of our issues is that people in Taumaranui, for example, often access health services in Hamilton, but because it's across the border in Waikato, they haven't had public transport to Hamilton. And it's very hard for us as a regional council if we were to say, well, let's start a bus just for the 5,000 people that live in Taumaranui to go to Hamilton. But there's this concept that Jarrett Walker, the public transport expert, talks about being on the way. There are some small towns that you might not think justify frequent public transport service, but if they are on the way between two much bigger places, then they can absolutely be served by frequent service. So because Taumaranui is potentially on the way between a Palmerston North to Hamilton service, if we're connecting two larger places, then there's no reason we can't incorporate them into that as well. And I should say too that some of our regional councils are looking very bold on this. Horizons don't have a lot of services that do this at the moment, but the Waikato already runs multiple services a day between Hamilton and Raglan, for example. And in their regional public transport plan, they have ambitions to see 20-minute frequency service between Hamilton and all of its major metro towns, so places like Ngaruawahia and Huntly, Cambridge. and 2 hourly service to the smaller places like Te Kuiti. So they're thinking very bold about these things, but the cost of those investments will be very small. I imagine actually the cost of some of those investments will be a lot cheaper than rail. But maybe one day they will build up the patronage base to start arguing for putting rail vehicles and rolling stock back on our train lines as well.
Anthonie Tonnon, I never really expected I'd get a fascinating insight into the network economics of public transport talking with you, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for being on When the Facts Change.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.